Most humans in life want to know the truth. They want to know the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But then there are some humans that would suppress the truth. And we can find evidence of that sometimes in these debates between Christians and atheists. In this one, we see Braxton Hunter and Matt Dillahunty. So let's see what happens.
However, ultimately, what Matt has said tonight is that Christian apologists or Christian theologians have not presented good enough reason to believe, or good enough reason that it would warrant belief in the Christian God. I think that much was clear. And so when we begin here tonight, I just want to say that it's important to understand what we mean by good enough evidence and bad enough evidence. That's very important in a debate like this. And when it comes to Matt's position, I think Matt would agree. This debate is not about Matt Dillahunty. It's not about Braxton Hunter. It's about you, and it's about God and where you stand with God and whether or not the Christian God exists. And so for that reason, it would be important for us to consider what Matt might think would count as good evidence. Now, my understanding is that Matt isn't sure what would ultimately count for good enough evidence because it hasn't been presented to him, and if it does exist, God would know what it is, but he couldn't put his finger on what would be convincing. That's what I've heard in the past. So we don't know what would count as good evidence to him, but we do know what would not count as good evidence for Matt. And I would wager that, and I don't mean to sound harsh with this, I really like Matt. You can tell he's a likable guy, enjoyable to listen to. But I think for most of you in the audience that might be skeptics or atheists, I don't think you have the level of skepticism or atheism that Matt himself holds to. In fact, frankly, and this is just a point about the position, not about Matt personally, I think it's frankly an unrealistic level of skepticism. In a 2017 debate at this conference with Mike Licona, Mike asked Matt, what if a comet collided with the moon and suddenly anyone could look up in the night sky and see that in multiple languages, Hebrew and Greek, it was written, God exists? What would you think about that was basically the question. And Matt's response was basically that all we could say about that is, quote, we don't know how or why this event occurred. In other words, that was the end of the quote, but in other words, he doesn't think that would count as good enough evidence. Now, folks, I think that that's major here tonight. I think for many people, if suddenly a comet collided with the moon and it said God exists in multiple languages, that would be pretty good evidence. Likewise, in a 2014 debate with Matt Slick, Slick asked, parting of the Red Sea, parting of an ocean. You're sitting there and someone says, in the name of Jesus, and the ocean parts. You going to believe in God now? Matt's response, no. Slick asks, well, what would it take? Matt Dillahunty says, I just told you, I don't know what it would take. So Matt doesn't know what it would take for him to believe, and if someone parted an ocean in Jesus' name, that would not count as good enough evidence to warrant belief. So I don't say this to throw mud at Matt. That is not the point at all. The point is this. If we're talking about what counts as good and bad evidence, and it's not also about whether those things have actually happened or will happen, that's a different point. The fact is that if they did happen, Matt wouldn't count that as good evidence. So if you're out there in the audience tonight as a skeptic or someone who's on the fence or an atheist, and those things, like it being written on the moon, or if the ocean parted in Jesus' name, if that would count as good evidence to you, this is pretty good evidence, well, then Matt's opinions about what should count as good and bad evidence, I don't think should have any serious hold on you. Now let's talk about what else he said in his discussion here. He said, you know, when you're going to bring a case for the Christian God's existence or something like that, then you shouldn't be bringing arguments that can be used by other religions. Now, he didn't actually spell this out, but he and I kind of think about the same sorts of things, and I think I know where he's going with this, and if I'm wrong, he can correct me later. But my first two arguments were arguments merely that God exists. The resurrection case was brought to demonstrate that what we're talking about here is the Christian God. You'll recall that I argued if God exists and God raised Jesus from the dead, then the Christian God exists, period. That's all there is to it. So the first two arguments that I brought were simple theistic arguments that could be brought by someone from another religion as long as it's a monotheistic religion, and perhaps maybe you could apply it in other cases. But the fact is, I didn't leave those arguments there alone. I followed them with a resurrection case to put a name tag on that God. This is the Christian God. So I'm not sure if he wants to say more about that later, but I'll look forward to what that will be.
Now, we do have evidence even written in the stars. If you look at Romans 1, you're going to see that God has told us that he has provided enough evidence for us in nature and the cosmos. He's written it in the stars. And here's the argument that Justin Brierley presented as one reason why he's still a Christian. Justin Brierley is the host of the Unbelievable podcast.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the cosmic dice. Like the gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose in the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it all. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe them, and nor should you. If I roll this dice, the chances of getting a 6 is 1 in 6. That's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, the odds get longer. It's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. So I'd have to be pretty lucky to get 2 6s in a row. Now, every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times, and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded, maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it.
And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I hope that that helps to convince any of you who have doubts. But if it doesn't, we're going to go into a little bit more. This is Inspiring Philosophy in a debate with Matt Dillahunty.
So premise 1, the mind exists. So no one with a mind can doubt this. This isn't really too controversial. Premise 2, the properties of the mind are not that which matter can have. So far, there is no evidence or theory which can show how consciousness or mental properties can reduce to matter. So John Sear says, how does a mental reality, a world of consciousness, intentionality, and other mental phenomena fit into a world consisting entirely of physical particles in fields of force? Colin McGuinn says, the problem with materialism is that it tries to construct the mind out of properties that refuse to add up to mentality. There is simply no evidence consciousness can emerge from matter. All neuroscience can show at best is correlation, not causation. However, the properties of matter that we experience can easily be reduced to mind. since all of what we experience is a world of qualia, taste, sounds, etc. See, we essentially experience a mental reality. So there's no reason to posit a discrete material world beyond what we experience. Keith Ward says it like this. Any physicist will say that brains are mostly empty space, in which molecules, atoms, electrons, and quarks, and other strange particles buzz about in complicated ways. It seems as though physical objects, when not being observed, have no colors and no sounds, smells, or tastes either. Sounds, like colors, are not physical events. Neither are smells, tastes, or sensations. Things do not smell like, taste like, or feel like anything when nobody is smelling, tasting, or feeling them. The physical world, it seems, is totally vacuous. No colors, smells, sounds, tastes, or sensations. What on earth is left? Second, two neuroscientists also recently argued space and the rate of time we experience are just emergent models of the mind, again correlating with this idealistic worldview. Thus, the first conclusion is mind is not reducible to matter. And then premise 3, substance dualism is unnecessary. So Matt, from what I gather, agrees with me on this, so I don't have to worry too much. I could argue this from Spinoza's interaction problem, but conclusion, all is mind. If all is mind, this correlates with the previous two arguments that there is a governing mind that brings us contingent minds, limited in matter, into existence and experience and operating reality. Finally, I want to remind people tonight, the debate is, are there good reasons to believe God exists? Now, I've presented several reasons to conclude yes. I've also presented nothing I've not presented on my channel. If Matt doesn't think these are good reasons, he must tear down these by offering better explanations for the data I've presented tonight. He probably is personally not convinced, and I would expect that. He's welcome to believe whatever he wants. But that is not an objective case against the reasons I've presented tonight. Instead, if he wishes to argue there are no good reasons to believe in God, or that he's not sure, he must account for this data with a more plausible and parsimonious explanation. I will contend any attempt will either not be plausible or parsimonious. So in conclusion, theism is more parsimonious, more plausible, and therefore more probable. Thank you.
And so we'll see how Matt responds.
If you can just let me know when I've got like a minute left to I didn't time this out.
You bet.
So first of all, thanks for setting this up, and thanks to you for showing up and presenting that. I don't have any slides. I'm not going to be quoting anybody, and I'm not going to be, doing what I'm told I must do. One of the curious things in a lot of these debates is that people will present their case and say that, therefore, this is a good reason or this is probable. And in order for me to, in order for my opponent to win, they must present a more plausible explanation. Well, that's flatly wrong. If the claim is there are good reasons to believe in God, I don't have to come up with better reasons to not believe in a God, or I don't have to come up with better explanations for something, because if there's a mystery in the world and the correct position is that we don't yet have compelling evidence to say that we have come to a good evidence-based conclusion on that, then that is the conclusion. And we are stuck in the position of, I don't have to have an explanation for something in order to be able to say that, hey, you presented something, but it's not quite there yet. As if we come.
So let's note here that what he is doing is he's not responding to any of the information that Michael presented. Michael talked a lot about mind over matter, the idea that we have a mind in the world, and that we also have consciousness, and a lot of these things are unexplained. One of the things that you might realize is mind always precedes matter. So there must have been a mind in the universe that preceded the matter, time, space, and matter. And so that's a big argument, and it's something that Matt can't argue against. And so rather than argue against it, he points out and switches a little bit to an argument for or against God. And so that's a typical approach. Here we have Tom Jump and Matt Dillahunty debating Randall Rouser and Sam Nissan on whether or not we have sufficient reasons to believe in God. And I thought that this was a pretty good point at this point. So let's see what we have to say.
The testimony is only reasonable if it's testimony of things that already have an empirical basis, things we already know exist in the world that are not purely imaginary. If you have testimony of other things, go ahead.
So I'll make a statement and then a question, and then I'll let Sam get in after that. But I need to respond to that. So the statement, well, so first of all, you've been, so the statement is, you're talking about what's extraordinary, right? Well, in fact, I hate to break it to you, but to the vast majority of people on Earth, belief in God, such as we've defined it here, is not extraordinary. So it seems to me that actually that's true. So it seems like you're just projecting your plausibility framework on everybody else and say, well, for me, that's extraordinary. This is not extraordinary. So you have to have additional evidence for that? Well, to persuade you, yes, but that doesn't mean they have to have additional evidence for them to be justified, because they have a different background set of beliefs, or what we call a plausibility structure, than you do. Now, Tom, you've been talking about this empirical corroboration, and it seems like you're appealing to a general epistemic principle here, that you have to have empirical corroboration in order to be justified in believing something. And if that is the case, you actually believe that, then I'm wondering, what's your empirical corroboration for the principle such that you can be justified in believing it?
No, the argument is that you need empirical corroboration of something that has no basis in reality. Like you need some way to differentiate imagination from reality.
That's
so for like, if I saw
question begging.
No. So like if I saw a dog, that would be reasonable for me to believe just based off of I see the dog. If I saw a unicorn, I should immediately think probably not the case. I should need some other way to verify that unicorns exist and shouldn't believe that. So what was the first thing you said? It was.
So the first one was that you're projecting your plausibility framework and saying,
right. So
then that's the demand for everybody.
Right.
So that's the sort of thing that we're seeing in a lot of these debates. Now, I'm going to point out that there have been a number of different debates involving both Matt Dillahunty and Tom Jump, and they've been presented evidence for God numerous times. They've been presented specific evidence for Jesus Christ numerous times. And so many times the responses are things like, I don't believe, I'm not convinced, you're making a claim, that's not evidence, lots and lots of different claims. So what happens when people listen to these claims and these really exaggerated issues? Like, for example, with Matt saying he wouldn't even believe in God if he saw it written in the sky. What happens? Well, here's what happens to the typical atheist who takes an honest approach to the information that's been provided.
Hey, I'm here with a new friend. His name's Alex, and Alex came up to me after a lecture tonight, and he told me an interesting story that has to do with the value of debates.
The first time I ever heard of Mr. Mike Licona was through the Mike Licona versus Matt Dillahunty debate. And the reason I came across that debate was because I used to be an atheist and actually an anti-theist. And it was actually after that debate that I started leading back into Christianity.
Yeah, man, that's awesome.
All right.
I'm so glad it had that kind of.
And actually, I use a lot of your debate points on that one.
Yeah.
Because you were talking about how you can't use the God detector in the natural world, I believe, right? Isn't that one of your points on that one? So I use that one often too.
Which is absolutely wonderful. We're always happy to hear that the angels are cheering right now because a new person has entered heaven. Thank you so much. I hope you like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, no matter whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God.